George D. Aiken was elected to the United States Senate in 1940 after serving Vermont for a decade in the legislature as lieutenant governor and governor for 4 years. At his retirement in 1974, Vermont had changed politically from the nation's most Republican state to a Democratic one, yet the Republican Aiken remained hugely popular.
Well, I've always gone on the theory that if they wanted me to go back to Washington, they'd send me back. If they didn't want me to go back, I didn't want to go back and represent people that didn't want me there. As far as I know, I don't recall ever asking anyone to vote for me, but maybe I did. Perhaps they got the idea sometimes to go and visit with them and stay so long they would volunteer their support in order to get me going.
34 years in Washington had not altered his Vermont way of plain speaking, which the nation as a whole had come to admire. His exit strategy for Vietnam, paraphrased as "declare victory and get out," has become a quintessential example of Yankee political wisdom. Aiken was a remarkably consistent man. He was always skeptical about the use of military force and expressed that forcefully in his maiden speech to the Senate in 1941 before Pearl Harbor. 40 years later, he was still introducing legislation supporting electric cooperatives and railing against the profiteering and monopolizing tendencies of the big boys.
There's been no politician in the 20th century that had the grounding that man had in reality. I mean, really, just basic reality.
He spent 34 years on the Agricultural Committee. Aiken knew from personal experience what it meant to live without electricity and what it meant to be a farmer. And Aiken never really left Vermont. His political career was, in the words of one historian, invariably true to his own experiences and those of his neighbors.
He could be the prototype of a great senator, really, the kind who understands why he's there, who understands the privilege of serving the American people, that he is a public servant.
Born in Dummerston, George Aiken grew up just miles away down the road in this mythical Vermont in the town of Putney, where his love for plants took hold early.
My grandmother had a beautiful flower garden. She started bushels of seeds each spring and had her living room. It wasn't used as a living room, it was just used as a plant room. And I'm sure the love of plants must have come from her.
George Aiken began his schooling close to home in a one-room schoolhouse.
And I went to the same little one-room red schoolhouse that my father did.
It was the mythical Vermont. It was what Dorothy Canfield Fisher liked to write about.
To complete high school, George Aiken walked some 8 miles to catch a daily train to Brattleboro.
He graduated from high school in 1908.
I think my father would have liked to go to UVM, but I know that in his family there was no money to do that, and so he didn't.
It was a no-choice situation for him. He had to go back and help his father on the farm, and from that he developed his professional specialty of being a nurseryman.
He'd rather be shot than have to milk a cow. I think he started his business the minute he got out of high school, started his acres and acres of raspberries and his strawberries, and then a little bit later his perennials. I picked raspberries every single summer. During the last days of World War I, it was a little hard to get workers. And so he used to have farmerettes, which were groups of girls from UVM who would come and spend their summers in tents working on the land. Sometime in the middle 20s, I imagine, he moved a lot of it down near the Putney Depot. And there he had fields and fields of perennials, and a greenhouse, and a packing shed.
That alone says George Aiken was a mover. He got things done. Heaven's sakes, over the 40 years he had the nursery, it seems like everybody in Putney worked for George Aiken, whether it be kids picking raspberries or older people planting plants.
In 1922, at the age of 30, George Aiken, like his father before him, ran for the state legislature as the representative for the town of Putney. It is the only election that he ever lost, so he stuck to his expanding nursery business, fulfilling a growing demand for plants fueled by a sophisticated mail-order catalog.
And he sold his plants all over the Northeast. A huge catalog of people that bought from his nursery in Putney.
The Aiken Nursery slogan rang, "Grown in Vermont, it's hardy," as Christmas wreaths were packed by the thousands for the New York and Boston markets.
And what he did was he had what they called magic lantern slides, which is the precursor to a slideshow. And he would set up in the local communities and he would give a talk on wildflowers. Very folksy stories about Vermont's wildflowers, and he would filter in Peter Rabbit.
He made quite a reputation doing this, and people knew who he was throughout the state. These were more in terms of advertising his nursery than in promoting his political future.
As Aiken's nursery business began to expand, the Depression hit. But day-to-day life in Vermont did not change much for those who lived up on the hills close to the land.
I don't remember that we lived any differently after the Depression came than we did before. People like our families didn't mind Depression because it wasn't any different than we'd always known.
When my father got out of law school and set up practice in Brattleboro, both he and Senator Aiken were fond of saying that George Aiken was his first client. Said that he had a few people who hadn't paid their bills, and he hired my father to try to collect some of that money.
They became lifelong, very close political allies and good friends.
In 1931, Aiken ran once again for the state legislature and was victorious.
I've often suspected 1930 being the dire year it was in terms of the Depression crossing America, and knowing that he first met Ernest Gibson, a Brattleboro lawyer, because Aiken had a lot of unpaid bills and he needed legal help going after people who owed him money. I suspect he needed the income.
The Aiken who arrived in Montpelier that January was a Republican in a state that had, without exception, Republican governors, senators, and representatives, as well as a Republican state legislature since the Civil War.
Within the Vermont Republican Party, George Aiken always had scorn and contempt for the so-called old guard.
They took their lead from the business interests. The progressives, again from Aiken's view, represented the common working person.
So in many ways, being a very progressive, independent Vermont Republican, he simply set his own course and followed it.
And then he went to the legislature and right away became a major player in the legislature.
In the fall of 1927, Vermont had suffered a dramatic and devastating flood. The water claimed 55 lives. 1,000 bridges were washed out. 10,000 were made homeless. So when George Aiken began his legislative career, flood control plans were being proposed. One such plan, the Barrows Plan, called for 35 dams along the Connecticut Valley. The dam sites would be given to private power companies, provided they would develop the dams.
Well, Aiken felt this was a giveaway. A great deal of Vermont energy was being sent to southern New England. A great many rural areas in Vermont really were not electrified, and he just resisted this. And he led the opposition. And what happened was the Barrows Plan was defeated, largely through his efforts.
At that point, he began to think about running for Speaker himself. He began working with Ernest Gibson Jr., lining up delegates. This is part of his luck. His main opponent then was a banker from Barry, and as the governor liked to say, who was going to elect a banker to anything in 1933.
He and the people that were supporting him for Speaker said, we're going to hand out little bits of, I think it was spruce clippings, and have all of our supporters wear them.
But it turned out when they actually started doing it, they gave it to everybody. So that when people first came in and they looked around the well of the house, everybody had a sprig on.
And so it looked like he had this overwhelming support, and he won.
By 1932, a great economic depression had settled over the nation. More than 20% of the nation's workforce was unemployed. The Democrats and President Roosevelt had come to power promising sweeping changes, a New Deal, as he called it. In the first term, legislation created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and Social Security. These were busy times for a politician with growing ambition. Yet in 1932, George Aiken published his first book, Pioneering with Wildflowers. The book was not just a reflection of Aiken's infatuation with wildflowers. Like most of Aiken's life work, it was a practical response to a problem. Constantly pushed back by immigrant people, immigrant animals, and even immigrant plants, many species are now making a gallant last stand in the face of extermination. We must learn to propagate and grow all worthwhile species, and the purpose of this book is to give others in plain language some of the knowledge of wildflower requirements I have learned. More than 20 years after his death, in its 26th printing, it remains an authoritative work on the subject.
He also had a wonderful introduction, which really, I think, personified his views.
Dedicated to Peter Rabbit, in the hopes that flattery will accomplish what traps and guns have failed to do, and that the little rascal will let our plants alone from this time on.
He wasn't going to, exterminate them. He wasn't going to kill all the rabbits. He was going to flatter them so that they wouldn't do as much damage.
Pioneering with Wildflowers was followed by Pioneering with Fruits and Berries. But George Aiken was advancing rapidly on a political career, which some attributed to luck.
He was shrewd.
So when it came time for him to run for statewide office, he basically turned the garden clubs, the women of the garden clubs of Vermont, into his campaign organization. It gave him a group of supporters in each town in the state, which was a tremendous advantage.
In 1935, Aiken won the lieutenant governorship and used the victory to push through state authorization of a federal program to bring electricity to the remote corners of Vermont. Once again, Aiken would face off with private power interests.
I think George Aiken opposed the private power companies because as a youngster growing up on a remote Vermont farm in Putney, he realized how essential power was to farmers like his own family.
He knew what life was like when you operated close to the bone, as he would say.
We had kerosene lamps for years and years, and I guess I must have been pretty well grown up when we finally had electricity.
Rural electrification was one of the huge changes of the 20th century. It often doesn't get enough play because historians are urban people, but getting electricity into rural areas was one of the great contributions that the New Deal made in the 1930s.
Creating the co-ops and the rural electric co-ops and providing support for them initially was necessary to provide electric service to areas where the private companies didn't find it economic to go.
The Congress had passed, at the request of Franklin Roosevelt, a enabling legislation to allow for rural electric co-ops. George Aiken, he arranged to have a copy of the enabling bill put on the train in Washington so it could arrive overnight to Montpelier in order to be acted on the next day by the Vermont legislature before it went home.
And of course, that night on the Montrealer came the language for the bill, and he got that through the legislature on the next day, and then they adjourned.
That led to the formation and the start of the Washington Electric Cooperative, which became the first rural electric cooperative in Vermont.
Aiken never really lost his bitterness over the fact that utility companies who refused to provide power to rural places would fight those who wanted to join together to help themselves. Almost 20 years later, Aiken would recall, "Only in the face of intense opposition were these American farms freed from darkness. The cooperatives met constant opposition on the economic, the political, and the propaganda fronts."
Over my lifetime, I've run into lots of people that older people, that's the big thing they remember about him, and they just would never forget what he did.
You have to characterize the Gibsons as very much colleagues of George Aiken. Collectively, they have been referred to as the Aiken-Gibson wing of the Republican Party.
Of course, it was entirely a one-party state during those years. The Republican Party was, for a long time, split between the Aiken-Gibson wing and the Proctor wing, or the conservative wing. The people versus the big boy interests, the big boys he often spoke of, the utilities, the power companies, National Life, the Granite Industries. I'm talking about the owners.
Certainly, it would have been hard for Aiken to get along well with people like the Proctors.
The Proctors were the epitome of the old guard Republicans. The family owned the Vermont Marble Company in Proctor. The town had been part of Rutland until the Proctors had it split off and renamed for themselves. The family had produced 4 Vermont governors: Redfield, the founder of Vermont Marble, Fletcher, Redfield the Younger, and Mortimer.
But I do think living as he did where he did, in the hills, is truly and importantly causative. So much different than Mortimer Proctor, you see, who was born rich, raised, and I'm not being pejorative here, but it was a different life when you lived in a town that was named after you. And the fact that you created because you owned the company that ran the town, you see, and that your father was a governor and so on. But Aiken, I just believe Aiken knew what it meant to hay on a day like this. You know, the pain, the sweat, the ginger water, and he really liked and appreciated those kinds of people. And he didn't want anybody telling those kinds of people how to live their lives, because he figured those kinds of people could handle it themselves. And I think that defined his localism in Vermont. It was that appreciation for common people.
Within the Republican Party in Vermont, there was a route of succession that was called the Proctor ladder. Aiken, in a way, followed that pattern. He was a town legislator, he was Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor, but he did it also very quickly. And furthermore, he did it at a time when the old mountain rule in Vermont, whereby Republicans from the west side of the Green Mountains would have to exchange opportunities with Republicans from the east side of the mountains.
And that worked without fail from 1870 to 1944. Think about that for a moment. Every single time a new governor came to the office, they lived on the opposite side of the mountains. That's how strong the Republican Party was. In fact, I've not seen in American politics a pattern of geographical causation that lasted as long without a break as that one. That the Republican Party of Vermont could just hand out the governorship according to where you lived.
But the governor, Charles Smith of Rutland, had some business reversals. His wife, I believe, had died. He was ill. He chose not to run again. And then all of a sudden there was a vacancy.
George Aiken was not hesitant about announcing publicly that he, Aiken, intended to run in '36. When he saw an opportunity, he didn't hesitate to seize it. And you see this turning up time after time.
Whether it been his nursery or his family or politics. And I think that he loved politics, and his wife Beatrice didn't like politics. She stayed home and tended to the home, the kids, the farm.
From the very beginning, given his political ideology, Aiken was quite popular with Democrats. And Democrats did vote for Aiken, and Democrats continued to vote for Aiken in the Republican primaries. And he won that primary. It was a three-person primary. He won that. He never, after that, had any trouble in any election. That was probably his toughest election. Not the election against Democrats. They didn't count.
In 1936, Roosevelt won again by a landslide, but not in Vermont. And George Aiken, winning the governorship, was one of the few successful Republican politicians in the nation.
Roosevelt put in place a safety net for Americans. And most Vermonters were against it.
Aiken's responses to the New Deal programs reveal much about his particular form of progressive republicanism. He spoke highly of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and Vermont received a disproportionate share of CCC projects.
I think something like the CCC camps at Aiken really liked that idea because they were pretty decentralized and it really helped people work and bail them out.
When the federal government proposed a forest to farms program that would transfer people from poor hill farms to the more prosperous valleys and towns, Aiken, the product of a hill farm, wrote in his 1938 book, Speaking from Vermont, "Why do folks live in the hills? The reason is that some folks just naturally love the mountains and like to live up among them, where freedom of thought and action is logical and inherent. Probably we have less money to spend than a big farmer or businessman, but we have a pretty large degree of happiness in our hillside makeup. It was not legislated upon us either. You can destroy happiness by legislation, but you certainly cannot force it upon anybody by the same method."
And Aiken was quite successful in battles with the federal administration. Became quite sought-after speaker because he also attacked the Republican Party for being the tool of big business. He went all over the country giving speeches, attacking the party for its being beholden and being run by big business. He was out of touch with the people, and if it was going to win anything again, it had to get in touch with the people. And he preached that lesson all over the country.
Few Republicans won major office across the country. It's understandable to see why so many national Republicans felt, well, maybe this Republican governor elected in Vermont, George D. Aiken, would be a likely presidential candidate in 1940.
People wanted solutions. People needed relief. It's time to turn in the top hat for the blue work shirt. The only way the Republican Party, in George Aiken's eyes, was going to become credible again was to offer positive programs, to offer support to those New Deal programs that didn't, in his eyes, play class against class. In December of 1937, he has an open letter to the Republican National Committee. He says you have to open up the party to the young. You have to offer these positive alternatives.
And he's famous for making a Lincoln Day address on the radio nationally in February of 1938, in which he said, incredibly, Abraham Lincoln would be ashamed of his own party if he came back to the United States today.
There was a lot of attention, a lot of editorials, a lot of newspaper writing about who is this man, Aiken, should he run for president, will he run for president?
In 1938, Aiken was re-elected as governor, and Speaking from Vermont was published.
Some people thought it was basically a campaign book, that he was putting it together as part of a campaign to run for president. And whether he was ever serious about it, my guess is that he was flattered and serious, but never lost his head over it.
I think George Aiken flirted with the idea of being a candidate, but he came to understand that in order to be a presidential candidate, you had to put your life in the hands of other people. And he was never willing to do that.
Because he never trusted anyone else to do his thinking for him or to prepare his public positions for him, and he certainly wasn't going to take any money from anybody he didn't know and couldn't trust.
Aiken was successful in his various tussles with FDR's New Deal. But despite this record, he remained at odds with Vermont's conservatives. The mountain rule was still in effect. Warren Austin from western Vermont was an old guard senator, but he was balanced by the progressive eastern senator, Ernest Gibson Sr. When Gibson died in 1940, Governor Aiken appointed his son, Ernest Gibson Jr., to the seat.
I've heard it was that Aiken appointed my father because he knew he wasn't going to run for the seat later on, and that he would just keep the seat warm for him, so to speak.
Aiken's luck was holding. The next rung on the Proctor ladder, the United States Senate, became unexpectedly vacant. Again, the real contest would be for the Republican Party's nomination, and in Ralph Flanders, he faced a formidable candidate.
Ralph Flanders was a Springfield industrialist, and Aiken always thought that that was the business interests had convinced Flanders to basically turn against his old friend and run against him in the primary.
Aiken prevailed, however, and was sworn in as Vermont's new U.S. Senator on January 10, 1941. He would never participate in another election where the outcome was in doubt.
He said that when he first went to Congress, the major business groups in the state of Vermont were all opposed to him. The granite outfit, power companies. But he just tried to forget that they were all against him, tried to treat them all equally.
It was hard for this Vermonter to be away from his roots in Putney, but his love of politics, combined with his confidence that he represented the interests of the working people of Vermont better than anyone else could, motivated him to be away from the hilly countryside he loved. It was his wife, Beatrice, who continued to maintain the hillside home and manage the nursery.
Beatrice Aiken was involved in so many things around the community, and she'd tear around the town like George D. himself. Elbows were worn out of his sweater, but it didn't bother him, and Beatrice lived the same way.
She kept the orchard. When he wasn't there, there was an apple orchard, there was peaches, apples, pears, raspberries.
Mrs. Aiken, Beatrice, she dies in '65. She doesn't like Washington, doesn't like Montpelier, but makes an effort in both. But she doesn't like being away from home.
Europe was already at war. When Senator-elect Aiken headed for Washington, the battle in the United States was between those who wanted to remain neutral and those who wanted to actively support Britain.
Despite the tremendous friendship between Ernest Gibson Jr. and George D. Aiken, they did disagree on foreign policy.
Roosevelt had proposed what came to be known as Lend-Lease. The United States would support Britain with arms and munitions and expect payment later.
Aiken, of course, opposed Lend-Lease in 1941, the enactment of Lend-Lease. His maiden speech in the Senate was in opposition to Lend-Lease.
The freshman senator spoke out vigorously against Lend-Lease and spoke of the dollar patriots, businessmen who would profit from war. The speech was controversial. The Brattleboro reformer declared Aiken a demagogue, setting the wealthy against the common folk.
This is his great distrust for big institutions, whether it's big oil, munitions makers, somehow using this excuse to give aid to Britain as a way to make more profits. And he would call them war with profiteers. Now this is a theme that plays out again for George Aiken during the Vietnam War that we can come back to.
He also felt that Roosevelt had too much power. Roosevelt was manipulating Lend-Lease very strongly. His speech, of course, was before Pearl Harbor. And after Pearl Harbor, then there wasn't any question about staying out of the war.
There were no isolationists after that. I mean, everybody was on board.
One of the ways that George Aiken kept in touch with World War II from the inside was his relationship with Ernest Gibson, Jr.
Ernie Gibson became a war hero.
And he was wounded in the South Pacific.
And there weren't very many senators, in the military at that time. And certainly few senators who saw real action the way he did in the Pacific.
And when my father was in the Pacific, they couldn't communicate by phone, but my father would keep up correspondence with Senator Aiken at the time.
And he apparently arranged to have Gibson brought back to serve in the Pentagon. So the last few years of the war, he was in Washington, D.C.
Lola Pierotti, a Montpelier native, went to Washington to work for the new senator as a secretary. After 3 chiefs of staff had left in 2 years, Aiken cast his eye on the young Lola.
And he called me in and he said, "You've been doing the work, so it's about time you got the title and the money." And I laughed.
She goes to Washington with him in 1941. Within 3 years, she becomes his top aide, and she stays his top aide all the way through. He marries her in 1967 and takes her off the payroll. So she, in effect, works without pay as his administrative assistant.
And he and Lola together were an unbeatable politician. But George Aiken always had a reputation for never forgetting anybody, but it was truly Lola that never forgot anybody's name.
Though now a senator, Aiken would always be known as the governor.
He thought being governor of Vermont was more important to him than being senator from Vermont.
In a sense, Aiken never really left Vermont. His Senate career reflects the fact that he remained true to his personal history and that of his state. In 1941, he joined the Agriculture and Forestry Committee and remained on it until his retirement.
In fact, he used to call this farm and about 3 times during sugaring and say, "How's sugaring? Sap running yet?" And then after a week or so, when he knew that sap was running, he'd call again. He says, "You're making syrup now, ain't you?"
Any senator who was interested in agriculture had a bond. Now, of course, there was rivalry, the wheat senators versus the dairy senators versus the sugar senators, but everybody understood that you had agricultural products in your state that you really had to protect.
George Aiken served all the time he was in Washington on the Senate, Agriculture, and Forestry.
And that was the vehicle he used for most of his important legislation.
Making agricultural products available globally as part of America's effort to convince the world to support us in the Cold War. You see it in welfare programs that would aid women and children.
George Aiken called and wanted me on a committee, Farm Service Agency, and every state has a committee of 3 farmers. Well, Vermont, as we all know, is dairy farming. George Aiken wasn't a dairy farmer, and he wanted orchards, fruit growers on that state committee. But I missed 1 or 2 of the first meetings that first year, and George Aiken called me. I was up the house, I remember it like yesterday, and scolded me for not attending those meetings. I never missed another one.
In 1945, Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman, who had been a Senate colleague of Aiken, was suddenly president.
George Aiken and Harry Truman were very much cut from the same cloth themselves. They were both small-town guys who never again lost touch with their roots.
I think also Harry Truman having never gone to college, George Aiken never having gone to college, both of them being rural people in many ways, shared a bond that crossed the political boundaries, and each one was very fond of the other.
In 1948, Truman surprised nearly everyone by winning a second term. The United States was now too powerful to remain isolated.
Our national government must show the way.
War had tempered George Aiken's view of America's responsibilities. He supported an internationalist foreign policy, voting in the mid-1940s for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. He basically agreed with the Truman and Eisenhower administration's responses to the Cold War.
It was a scary time. The atomic bomb had been dropped. The sense was that war could happen in seconds, and that presidents had to be able to respond. For the most part, the Congress followed them, on the assumption, of course, that presidents would take that authority and use it responsibly. And the Senate and the House, I think, gave away a lot of that role in the early Cold War years. But eventually there was a president who cashed in the blank check that they wrote him. In 1950, Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, went to Wheeling, West Virginia, and held up a document which he said he had a list of 200 communists who were actually working in the State Department at that time, who were known by the Secretary of State to be communists. And there was a lot of question as to how accurate this information was, and they were naming names of people, and they were really destroying reputations of people. Eventually, of course, Senator McCarthy went too far. He attacked everybody under the sun, and he attacked the United States Army. And of course, President Eisenhower had spent his entire adult life in the United States Army. It was the one branch of government that he was not going to allow to be attacked.
Aiken voted for censure. In 1952, Eisenhower had won the presidency, and for the first time in Aiken's career, the Republicans were in the majority. In 1954, the same year McCarthy was censured, Aiken joined the Foreign Relations Committee.
Senator Aiken was on the Foreign Relations Committee, but even on foreign relations, when the agricultural issues came up in terms of trade, that's when he began to speak out, because those are issues that were going to affect the people who lived in Vermont.
He early on understood that he was much more in favor of economic aid to country X rather than military aid.
And so senators who were interested in agriculture policy often got onto the Foreign Relations Committee because it was going to have a connection. And Senator Aiken was very much interested in agricultural issues in a foreign policy setting.
He said once that for all the money we spend on all the military arms we dispense globally, probably the greatest achievement for peace would be reached if a huge airplane was filled with tins of Vermont maple syrup, and we simply distribute this around the world. It was so sweet, it would probably do more for international peace than all the other Cold War activities we were funding.
Under Eisenhower, the liberal Republican wing of the party flourished, and George Aiken enjoyed close ties with Eisenhower's White House.
I remember the governor calling the president one morning, a Saturday morning. He needed the Secretary of Agriculture to stop a bill, and it was going to come up on Monday. And no one at Agriculture knew where he'd gone, and the governor called the president, and Eisenhower said, "What's the number of the bill?" And he said, "I'll call and have it stopped," and he did.
George Aiken was beginning to accumulate power.
I've heard pejorative attacks on him from the western part of the state that's saying that's why Vermont has the interstate on the eastern side, was because of George Aiken.
When the thruway was planned to go up this valley, it was planned to go up the other side of the state. There was a Proctor and other prestigious names on that side. But George Aiken knew that if that thruway went up through this side of the state and into the Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, it might be just the survival of that part of Vermont.
The idea of making the St. Lawrence River navigable for large ships had been around for a long time. For Aiken, Its attraction was the cheap power that would accompany the shipping component. In 1943, despite a wartime economy, Aiken introduced a bill to create the St. Lawrence Seaway.
I think George Aiken realized that if the Seaway was developed and power was developed as part of that project, then cheap power would be affordable by Vermonters, and that would help people dealing in the state with the very high cost of power.
The legislation enabling the Seaway construction did not pass until 1954. It was completed in 1959.
And when that bill finally passed, one of those seaways should have been named after the governor.
Aiken was always a Republican who supported Republican presidents, but his growing reputation as a man of common sense and integrity allowed him to be a particularly good bridge builder and crafter of compromises, and that evolved into a certain kind of power.
He often had good advice to give, and I think that's why presidents, Republican presidents and Democratic presidents alike, found him a comfortable person to talk to.
How could you not like Aiken? I mean, he really did have a way of getting at the truth in a simple way that one could understand. And I think any president with any brains would want to have that kind of guy around. You know, be able to call on a good old common sense. You know, let's see what George Aiken would say about that. That'll give us something, and you could count on it.
George Aiken, as U.S. Senator, was always willing to support anything on the merits of the bill, regardless of its sponsorship. And if a Democrat like John F. Kennedy was in favor of something and Aiken thought it was a good idea, it didn't bother him that a Democratic president wanted it.
Kennedy made sure that Aiken was included when the U.S. delegation arrived in Russia to sign the first nuclear test ban treaty in 1963.
Right behind the president, signing the nuclear test ban treaty. I think it was one of the great moments in history for America. The first the steps to control the nuclear genie.
George Aiken was very much in the vanguard of trying to get civil rights legislation passed in the U.S. Senate.
There were a lot of Southern senators who were, you know, holding back on civil rights and that sort of thing.
In 1957, George Aiken co-sponsored the Anderson-Aiken Amendment, prompting the passage of the first civil rights legislation in 85 years.
George Aiken said that one of the worst things that can happen to a society is for the rich to get divided from the poor. And anything that divides a society, racially, economically, regionally, is not good public policy from a national viewpoint. And even though he had very few Afro-Americans as constituents in Vermont, and even though he had a very close friendship with senators from Mississippi, he still realized this was the right thing to do, and he did act politically in favor of what he thought was simple justice.
Now is the time.
In 1964, when a more sweeping civil rights bill came up, Aiken was again in the forefront.
He and 6 other senators, including Senator Mike Mansfield, worked together to get that bill through the U.S. Senate.
He would be the bridge between moderate and liberal Republicans and Democrats and whomever he could get in the South. That's what George Aiken did for a living in Washington.
He's famous, of course, for his regular breakfasts with Senator Mike Mansfield, a Democratic power in the U.S. Senate from Montana.
And they had breakfast together every single morning in the cafeteria down in the Senate office building. And it was famous that they were eating breakfast every single morning. There was only one other person who joined them regularly, and that was Lola, who was Senator Aiken's administrative assistant and eventually Senator Aiken's wife. I think she might even have brought them together at some point.
We share breakfast almost daily in the Senate cafeteria and have for the past 19 years.
I asked Mike Mansfield one time, and he said, when I came to the Senate my first day, I was in the cafeteria and I didn't know a soul. You were behind me, he said, and you touched me on my back, and you said, Senator Aiken is over sitting at a table over there, and I'm sure he'd love to have you sit with him. He said, I've been sitting with him ever since.
It forged an alliance, and a very important alliance. And when Mansfield needed to do something on a bipartisan basis, especially when Vietnam came along, George Aiken was a perfect person for him to include in his missions to Vietnam and the reports that they were issuing.
It has become something of a joke in the Senate to say that when Mike Mansfield speaks, you know what George Aiken is thinking.
The governor, as we called him, felt that Lyndon Johnson had made a great mistake in escalating the war in South Vietnam.
In 1964, in response to a supposed North Vietnamese attack against U.S. destroyers, President Johnson summoned Aiken and other congressional leaders to the White House to gain support for what became known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution.
The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was another step towards the gradual escalation of the war. And at each of those steps, George Aiken is skeptical that military power or increased use of it will, in turn, bring that conflict to a conclusion.
At the end of the meeting, feeling boxed in by presidential power, Aiken is caustic. By the time you send it up, there won't be anything for us to do but support you. With reservations, Aiken votes for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. In 1965, Johnson asked the Democrat Mike Mansfield to lead a delegation to visit Vietnam and recommend a course of action.
Mansfield told Johnson he would only do it if George Aiken would come with him. And they went all around Vietnam.
While in Saigon, Mansfield and Aiken were invited to stay at the home of their old Senate colleague, Henry Cabot Lodge, now the U.S. ambassador in Vietnam, virtually running the show.
And in the middle of the night, there was a banging on the door, and a Marine opened the door and said, there's been a disaster. A lot of our soldiers have been killed and hurt. They went to the hospital, and the governor said it was a mass of blood. And I think that began to affect Governor, too, when he saw so many dead. They went from Vietnam, they went to Cambodia.
Heard all sorts of estimates from career military people about how well we were doing and how promising our prospects were. I think his initial gut reaction was to doubt the validity of that very upbeat assessment.
But the governor said to see those soldiers, a horrible sight.
Upon returning, the delegation prepared a report for President Johnson.
The report was Vietnam, Shadow and Substance. It basically says, you cannot win this war. The policy that you're on is not going to work. They do their report in early January '66.
The report is largely ignored by the administration, and the war continues to escalate.
Anybody can put their own definition on a no-win policy. Maybe if we get out of there with the respect of the world and the whole hide, if I may use a Vermont expression, that would be a win.
Do you have any idea how we could get out that way?
By October of 1966, Aiken makes what is now the famous speech called Declare Victory and Withdraw.
Declare victory and get out? He never said that exactly. That wasn't what his speech said, but that was the gist of his speech, and he was quite ready to adopt that, let that ride as the shorthand version. That's certainly what he meant to say.
I think probably in retrospect, his wisdom about getting out of there early probably was very good.
It sounded so sensible. It sounded like a neat way to get out of a terrible quagmire, but it became one of the most quoted remarks from that war.
Don't cut and run exactly, but cut your losses and then say you won, you've done what you meant to do, which is put the South Vietnamese government in charge and then leave.
He was doing a lot of worrying about Vietnam. And I mean a lot of worrying, because I'd see him at his desk and he would be just sitting there, and you had a feeling that something was bothering him. And the other staff people noticed that he appeared to be very bothered about something. Vietnam bothered him.
There's a very famous picture of him on the cover. The New York Times magazine, and he's neither the hawk nor the dove, but the wise owl.
When Nixon invaded Cambodia in 1970, George Aiken said, "This action was so contrary to Vermont public opinion that he doubted the president could be elected dog catcher."
And Nixon took great umbrage at that comment and referred to it, in fact, in a national televised speech.
And of the Christmas bombing of 1972, Aiken would write in his Senate diaries that it was a sorry Christmas present for the people of the United States. We may call it a week of shock, dismay, and disbelief. I do not hesitate to say that the renewal of the bombing is a bad mistake. Yet in general, Aiken was supportive of Nixon's gradual withdrawal of forces, and as the Watergate scandal lurched to its conclusion, Aiken remained a steadfast supporter of the president.
For a long time, George Aiken blamed Nixon's staff for Watergate cover-up, rather than Nixon himself.
He was absolutely capable in Vermont of fighting the establishment in the Republican Party, but he was always a Republican. I mean, he defended Nixon to the end. He's famous, of course, for that quote, "Why don't we declare war, victory in Vietnam and leave?" But he also was quoted with Nixon as, "Why don't you impeach him or get off his back?"
And that's the quote Aiken used in a speech in November of '73. That wasn't aimed at the press. That was aimed at his fellow politicians. Aiken came to a conclusion. Nixon had lost his support, and he needed to resign.
Watching Nixon fall apart, you could see that nothing could put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It was a great tragedy. And we all knew that he would no longer be president for one way or another. The other shoe was going to fall.
Before he went on nationwide television to announce that he was going to resign, he asked a few people to come to the White House to meet with him, and he, in effect, told them in advance that he was going to resign. George Aiken told me, Nixon is weeping. He's talking about his Quaker mother, and Aiken describes the room as not a dry-eyed in the room. He goes back to his apartment on Capitol Hill to watch the actual event, and he is, afterwards, he tells me how amazed he is to see the composure that Nixon has when he's on national television, when he knows, because he was in the same room with him less than a half an hour before he went on, in which he was an absolute emotional basket case.
George Aiken was very scrupulous through his entire lifetime on using as little money as possible when he ran for re-election and making sure there was no hanky-panky about where that money was coming from.
For a campaign was, I think, one year $34.
In 1 year he spent less than $20 on getting re-elected to the Senate.
The grand total of $17.09.
He'd come to Vermont and travel around and go to barbershops and talk to people, find out what was going on. So philosophically, I don't think he ever wavered from being a populist.
He had the so-called common touch.
He was the quintessential Vermonter. He was an absolute delight to talk to, and it took me a while to realize how much of that persona masked a master politician behind that folksy sort of way.
Yeah, aw shucks stuff. He knew his way around. He had an intellect. He was a bright man.
One of the things that Senator Aiken had, one of the great gifts that he had that enabled him to be a great compromiser, was he had a wonderful sense of humor. Things do get tense around here. And so Aiken's gentle humor, I think, went a very long way. People felt great relief after he involved himself in the issue. And when he wanted something, they were very willing to give it to him. And so he usually got what it was that he came into that meeting seeking.
In his eyes, politics was a matter of interpersonal relationships. And this comes through time after time. Where does that come from in Aiken's life? Being amiable with your neighbors in politics, and good politics being good neighborhood relations. It may come just from his small town upbringing, realizing that in a small town meeting, even though people might disagree fervently with one another, they still had to live with one another and be neighborly. So I think he simply carried that small town tradition with him all the way through his era of Washington politics.
Was he shrewd? Oh yeah. Was he a good politician? Sure was. But he couldn't hide his kind of basic values. They just emerged from him. I think every Vermonter should read Speaking from Vermont. He has this passage, why do people like to live up in the hills? And he says, there's something inherent in hill people, an inherent love of liberty. And he says, I look out this evening over the valleys and I see my neighbors' houses' lights twinkling in the distance. So he's a hill person. And he says, some of them are better than mine, others of them aren't quite so good. But we all share a certain kind of neighborliness and togetherness.
None of us would willingly move away, Aiken concluded. 2 years after Aiken wrote that, he left for Washington on his extended journey through the halls of power and national politics.
People can rise above the expectations often assigned to them, and it happened with George Aiken. Brought up on a backcountry farm, riding the train down to Brattleboro to finish up high school, not being able to go to college, being out there working with his hands, working in cold weather. This man had expectations for himself, and when he got there, through the fortuitous flux of events that got him to high office, he knew how to achieve things for the people that sent him there.
Aiken's compass had never faltered. Responding to his colleagues' remarks at retirement, he wrote, "Going back to Vermont will not be as difficult as they seem to think it ought to be." Historian Ralph Nading Hill would write that Aiken's retirement to his Vermont orchard left the capital's supply of agrarian morality sadly diminished, if not depleted.
When you read Aiken's book, Senate Diary, compared to his book, Speaking from Vermont, he's retiring from the United States Senate. He's sitting in the same place, and it's a cold, vicious winter night. And he says,
"When we got to the house on the mountain in Putney, we found that the neighbors had cleaned the snow off the steps. Now, instead of seeing the Capitol and the Washington Monument, we see Mount Monadnock and the nearby hills of Vermont covered with 1 to 2 feet of snow. The chickadees and blue jays were on hand to meet us. Vermont is a welcome relief from the atmosphere in our nation's capital for the last few years. It's good to be home."